Okay, so when you think of February 14th, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Probably hearts, flowers, chocolates, right? Well, the real story behind the holiday, it's a whole lot darker and honestly way more interesting. It's a story of defiance, faith, and sacrifice. So let's get into the real story of St. Valentine.
Yeah, pretty much everything we associate with Valentine's Day today is a pretty modern invention. The legend we all know is about romance and Cupid, but the reality? The original story is about standing up to an entire empire, about an incredible faith, and about making the ultimate sacrifice. We're talking about two completely different ideas of what love even means.
So that brings up the big question. Who was the real St. Valentine? Let's push aside the greeting cards and the boxes of chocolate for a minute and travel way back in time to figure out who this person actually was and what he did that was so important.
All right, our journey starts in 3rd century Rome. And let me tell you, this was a time and a place that's about as far from a romantic comedy as you can get. Understanding what was going on back then is absolutely crucial to getting the real story of Valentine. So, picture this. The Roman Empire is in chaos. We're talking constant war, political drama, just a really tough time. The guy in charge is Emperor Claudius II. They called him Claudius Gothicus. And bubbling just under the surface of this empire is this new and often persecuted religion called Christianity. Now, Emperor Claudius, trying to get his military in shape, makes this absolutely drastic decision. He bans young men from getting married, outlaws it completely. His logic? It was pretty cold, actually. He figured single soldiers had fewer ties, less to lose, and would be much more focused on fighting and dying for Rome. And this is where Valentine enters the story. He's a Christian priest, and he sees this imperial ban and decides he's not going to follow it. But for him, this wasn't really about playing Cupid. It was a revolutionary act of faith, of caring for his people.
So, what does he do? At the very heart of his story is this incredible act of defiance. Valentine secretly starts marrying young couples, going directly against the orders of the most powerful man in the world. He knew the risk he was taking, but why? Why was this so important to him?
Well, see, for Valentine and other Christians, marriage was way more than just a legal thing. It was a sacrament, a holy promise, a covenant, not just between two people, but between them and God. And in their worldview, no emperor, no government had the authority to forbid something that God himself had created. So this wasn't just rebellion, it was defending God's law against man's law. Well, as you can probably guess, Valentine was eventually caught. He was arrested and executed for his defiance. But his death? Well, that was really just the beginning of his legacy, a legacy that has lasted for centuries, especially inside the Catholic Church. For Catholics, his importance really stands on three main pillars. First, he's a witness to the holiness of marriage. Second, there's a belief in his power of intercession, basically that he can pray for people from heaven. And third, you have the legendary story of his very last message.
And here's where things get a little unexpected. You know, we call him the patron saint of love, right? Well, he's also the patron saint of beekeepers and people with epilepsy. It's kind of random, but it's a great reminder that his story has a much broader spiritual meaning than just romance.
Okay, so this brings us to that famous sign-off. The story goes that while he was locked up, Valentine performed a miracle. He healed his own jailer's daughter who was blind. And then, right before he was executed, he wrote her a final note. And he signed it from your Valentine. But you see, this wasn't a romantic letter. It was an act of Christian love, of compassion, even for the people who were holding him captive. So, how in the world did we get from a 3rd century martyr to a 21st century explosion of cards and candy? The way this holiday transformed over the centuries is a pretty wild story all on its own. This timeline really hits the high points. So he dies around 269 AD. Then, a couple hundred years later, in 496, the church makes February 14th his feast day, partly to replace an old pagan festival. But then, and this is the part nobody ever talks about, in 1969, the Catholic Church actually removed him from the main universal calendar simply because there's just not a lot of solid historical proof about his life. When you boil it all down, the story of the real St. Valentine points to this huge difference between two kinds of love. The holiday we celebrate today is all about eros, that's romantic, passionate feeling. But the martyr's story? That's a story about agape, a selfless, sacrificial love, a commitment to something bigger than yourself, even if it costs you everything. So, as this February 14th rolls around, maybe it's worth thinking about the guy it's actually named after and asking yourself, what does love really mean? Is it just a feeling, or is it a sacrifice?